Good afternoon, and welcome to breakout number 4. We'd like to extend a special welcome to those joining us via simulcast once again. Thanks for sticking with us today. My name is Troy Endress, and this session is entitled The Smart Furrow. And so, as I was preparing for this session, I was beginning to ask myself, what does it actually mean to be smart? You hear us talk about being smarter every season, but how do you become smarter? And so if you look up the definition of smart, it essentially means to gain knowledge or acumen. But it's not so much the definition that's important, it's how do we actually become smarter? And so I thought about myself, how have I learned in the past? And one of the ways that I learn is essentially from others. And so some of you may be joining us for the first time today. My hope is that you've learned something new that you could maybe go back and implement on your own operations. And some of you have been joining us for years because you understand that we try to bring value to you every single year to help challenge the status quo and take you to the next level. But for me personally, I can get a lot of information, and most of the time, I don't actually take it to heart until I learn it for myself. And my guess is that some of you can probably relate to that. When I think about learning for myself, typically that involves cost or pain by the time I figure it out. Anybody else relate to that? And so, this is a picture of my brother's engine in his minivan. And now, why would my brother send me a picture of his engine? He has a Chrysler Town & Country. He knows that I also have a Chrysler Town & Country. And he now is on the second major repair for this vehicle in the last 2 months, having had just replaced his transmission. So based on his painful experience, what do you believe his advice is to me when I show you this picture? Exactly. He's telling me you should really trade your van off, right? Now, me being a little bit naive, potentially a little bit stubborn, I think about my own van and I ask myself, well, I wonder how many miles he has on that thing. To which he responds 144,000. Knowing that I'm well under 100, I can say with confidence, well, I still have at least 50,000 to go, right? He tells me I don't trust him over 100, so I have to make a decision what to do with this new information that's been bestowed upon me. And so let me take you to a text I received from my wife 2 weeks ago. Something wrong with van. Where do you think my mind goes immediately? Worst case scenario. Is it even drivable? And I take you now to Exhibit B, which shows the mileage on my minivan of 94,467 miles with a diagnosis of a bad transmission. Okay? So now I've experienced pain and cost. And so when my colleague sends me a text message with the odometer on his minivan that shows 94,998 miles, what do you believe my advice to him is now? Trade it tonight, right? I don't want him to experience the same pain that I've encountered. And so I take this back to this past spring. This past spring had some pain points, didn't it? There were some costs that were incurred, and so this could be weather-related. This grower might be able to look at this and say, I've got some opportunities to gain and pick up some new opportunities for this next year by adding some tiling, some drainage. In our neck of the woods, we'd be ditching. And I show you a picture like this on the left, where this grower would probably tell you today that he had his best corn crop ever. But as he's out scouting his field, he realizes that his closing system was incapable of managing all the environments he placed it in this past year. Or I show you a picture like this that I took. And we talk about managing fertility well. And I know exactly where the knives of the anhydrous went in this field. And I know that not every one of those plants had the exact same experience. And there's a cost to that. And as you're out scouting your own crops, and we've talked about it for years, when we find delayed emergence in the field, and there's plants that are 1 and 2 leaf collars behind, we have to make a decision about, can I fix this? Is it my problem or is something else? So based on the information you have in your scouting, can you fix this, yes or no? Here's another picture I took from this past summer. Now, from the road, this looks like a pretty good stand of corn. Would you agree with that? This is a grower that I would say pays attention to details. He has his fertility dialed in. He understands what hybrids he needs to plant on his farm. He's doing things right. He has technology in the cab. But there's a problem. We walk out into his field and all the plants are there, but there's a severe cost. How did this happen? He'd done nothing differently than he had done previously, and he's had success. He's heard and received information. He's making a decision based off the information he has today. And what happened in this scenario is he planted the first 2/3 of his corn crop in May this year. He got rained out for 3 weeks. He comes back the first week of June when it's finally fit to go again. It's a Monday. They're calling for rain on Wednesday. He has not missed a rain all year long. So what does he do? The same thing I did on the first 2/3 of the crop that looks really good when it emerged. And he goes and plants on June 2nd, and he doesn't get a rain. 5 straight days and 90-degree temperatures, wind blowing. And along with some mechanical challenges, we can see how quickly a moisture line changes in this environment. And so some of you are thinking, well, Troy, that would never happen to me. I make better decisions on the day of planting. You heard Jason Webster mention this morning this term of the 7 costliest words in business are, we have always done it that way. I'm beginning to believe that that may not necessarily always be true. It might be more like this in agriculture. This will never happen on my farm, right? It only happens on my neighbor's farm. And so when we think about getting smarter every season, ultimately it's a choice. And it's not a choice that anybody else in this room can make for us. It's our choice. So the choices you make today based on the information you have, are they the right decisions? And so I take you to this operator in the cab. And what he's going to do on the day of planting, he's going to take the information he has available to him in the cab. He's going to be looking outside his back window, trying to determine whether or not he is doing the best job possible at this spot in the field on this day in this season. And he gets the hired man out there and he says, hey, dig for me a few times, right? He goes back there and he digs a couple times and he's going to give him a thumbs up. He's going to say, hey, we need to take a look at this, or a thumbs down, we need to make an adjustment. The problem is he doesn't trust this one guy, so he brings everybody out, right? He says, okay, I need better visibility. Everybody get behind the planter, dig out every row for a couple passes, and tell me if I'm doing a good job. Then I'm going to go thumbs up or thumbs down. The problem is, even in this scenario, this grower, this operator, has limited visibility because he's making a decision based on this spot in the field, on this planter pass, on this day, this season, for this crop. And so throughout the day, you've heard about some new technologies and opportunities to learn more and get information in real time in the cab to make better decisions on the day of planting. And so one of those tools that we talk about a lot is Smart Furrow around here. Only thing like it in the industry where it gives us the opportunity to see furrow metrics that helps us make decisions on the day of planting. Things like furrow moisture, temperature, clean furrow, organic matter, CEC. But as I travel and I ask growers, hey, how are you utilizing this tool? Sometimes I get the responses, you've told me about the information, I know what the number is, but I'm not really sure if I'm using it to its full capacity because I don't really understand what I'm seeing. And so if I take you to a farm today, those of you who are running it, do you ever wonder if that information is accurate? Do you ever wonder if I ignore this, is it actually going to cost me? How about furrow moisture? What do we say about furrow moisture? What is the target we look for in corn? 30%, right? Where's that 30% number come from? We know that corn needs to take up 30% of its weight in water in order to fire for germination. And so we're going to characterize the soil. So if I take you into a soil lab back in R&D back here, there's 100+ soil types, and we're going to try to evaluate these soils and understand not how much water we put into the soil, but how much water that soil gives back to us. And so I give you an example of 3 different soil types. And let's just make it personal for you. How many of you believe you have potentially 3 different soil types in the same field? Yes or no? A couple of you? All right. So let's go out. I'm going to put a rain gauge in soil type A, soil type B, and soil type C. And you tell me that everywhere on your farm you get 1 inch of rain. Okay? When you go out and plant that crop, did the seeds across all 3 of those environments have the exact same experience? Yes or no? So if I go into a lab test and I take these 3 different soil types, a loamy sand, a clay, and a silt loam, and I take a known amount of water for all those soils, I pour those in, I weigh those. Terry is now going to scan those with a Smart Furrow, and she's going to give me a reading based on what the Smart Furrow moisture metric is. And she says, Troy, it looks like in the loamy sand, the amount of water I poured in gave you 43% available back to the seed. Did you keep planting that day? Yeah, you do, because we've told you 30% is what is needed to germinate the seed. How about in the clay? Is 31% sufficient for you to keep going? Should be, right? At least on that spot in the field. But I take you to soil type 3, that silt loam only shows 24%. Now you have a decision to make. Do you trust what the information you're receiving and make an adjustment, or do you keep planting? And why I bring this up is I've talked to a lot of growers, and I asked them about this past spring in particular, and I say, what did your furrow moisture maps look like? And they would say things, it's pegged green, Troy. All year long was 40+% furrow moisture, and that's possible. But I said, did you pay attention all year long? Because there got to a point this year where we had to just go, right? And we might have some colors and lights flashing at us over here and numbers flashing, but we didn't make decisions. I said, dig a little deeper. I want to know what your maps look like on other fields as you progress throughout the season. And they would send me maps like this. From 2019, there was areas of this field that were getting dry, the furrow moisture was not available, and yet the grower had the information and chose not to act. Okay? 2018, the exact same scenario. The grower had the information that he was losing moisture or did not have adequate moisture in this part of the field, and he failed to act. And so it's kind of a running joke around here. We talk about the decision to change depth. And we talk about planting to the second knuckle, right? So you've dug, and you said, every time I dug, the second knuckle shows me I've got moisture, so I keep going. But your Smart Furrow is telling me I only have 18% available furrow moisture. What should you do? You should probably go deeper if you trust the data. What happens if you don't trust it? Let me give you an example from a grower I work with in Southeast Illinois. From 2018, first time he's running this technology. And he's got a lot of things going on, and he's trying to understand all these metrics, and he's heard us teach him about this 30% metric. But not until he goes to harvest the field and he looks at the yield map, he says, well, Troy, there's something going on here. If I look in the northeast corner of this field, as well as the south half of this field, I have lower yielding environments. And so he's a good farmer. He wants to say, what layer should I look at to begin to diagnose what happened here? What's the first thing he should look at? Anybody know? If you have a lower yielding environment, who do you want to blame? The seed guy, right? I want to know if I changed hybrids. And sure enough, you can see in the northeast corner of this field, there absolutely was a hybrid change. And then I look at his planting date, and I know why. He said, Troy, I had some replant in here. I went to a shorter day hybrid in the northeast corner. Therefore, that's probably why it was lower yielding, right? But on the southern half, on the west side of this field, we still have that environment. And so we start looking through his data. And we look at population. It wasn't a response to population. We'll look at things like organic matter. It looks fairly consistent when you think about CEC water holding capacity. Not until he got to his furrow moisture map to begin to see some correlations. And so I blow that up, and I started asking questions. I said, what happened here? He says, it was spring applied manure. I went in, I worked the ground, I opened up the field, planted around. And then I started working on the south half of this field, planting the east and west rows. And I saw this metric changing and dropping to reds and yellows, but I didn't make an adjustment until I called my dealer and asked him what I'm supposed to do. The dealer said, hey, if it's showing you don't have furrow moisture, go down till you find it. So he goes down 1/4 inch. And you can tell when he starts planting on the west side of this field, going north and south, that's where the map goes green. And so he has the information. He's made a decision. He wanted to know what it cost him. So we run a region report here out of field view, and you can see on the south half of this field, corn went 209. That's pretty reasonable, isn't it? But the reason he was concerned about it is because he knew the other area of the field went 240. There was a 31 bushel difference. Now, I don't want you to take your take home to be, Troy told me, every time I planted in moisture versus not, it's a 30 bushel increase. Okay? Just so happened on this field for this grower in this year, that it was a huge hit. And we know the cost of planting in a dry dirt. So I give you two different growers. Grower one had information available to him. Based on the information he had, he made the best decision he could on the day of planting. Weather forecast, technology in the cab. But there's still a cost, isn't there, when we get it wrong? There's also an opportunity because now this grower understands I have tools available to me to ensure this never happens to me again. So he's going to put those tools in place. How about grower number two? Grower number two had the tools, but he wasn't exactly sure what to do with those. So he had a cost on the south half of that south portion of that field. However, he had an opportunity to ensure that when the data comes in, I make a decision right away before it costs me too much. So when you can see it, you adjust. When you can't see it, you won't adjust. And so that's my challenge to you as we think about getting smarter every season. Do you have the information available to you to make the best decision today. So the other thing that we get a lot is questions around other crops. This might be shocking to some of us, but there are other crops other than corn in the world. And so some of you are running technology on your planters like Smart Furrow that giving you furrow moisture, and you're saying, well, what do I do in soybeans or other crops? What is the metric to shoot for? And so we look at a crop like a soybean. We know a soybean will absorb a higher percentage of its weight in water, much quicker to germinate, but we don't exactly know what number you should be shooting for. And so we began running down a path to look at crops like cotton and wheat and sugar beets and soybeans and sunflowers and saying, what is the right amount of furrow moisture for each of those crops on your day of planting to ensure that you get the most consistency across that entire field? And so I take you into the lab. This is Mike Sternad. He's back there, and he's manually placing seeds into trays, one at a time, 6 different crops. And we're going to put that in a lab setting. And I want to show you what that might look like. This is initial test number 1 in a lab, okay? I want you to understand this is a lab test only. But we're looking at corn from left to right, corn, cotton, wheat, sugar beets, sunflowers, and soybeans at moisture level 3. Now, you don't know what moisture level 3 is yet, but we want to watch the consistency of emergence from one seed to the next in a lab environment. And you can see that at moisture level 3, we're starting to get some plants out of the ground. And so now we're going to stretch this out over 10 days. And over these 10 days, you can see it counting up here over in the left-hand corner. We've got moisture levels, as read by Smart Furrow, of 21, 28, 35, 39, 47, and 60% on 6 different crops, 6 different moistures. And as we watch these start to germinate, and I don't know exactly if 10 days is the right amount of length, but we're looking at this and saying, how do we drive consistency in different crops? And we can tell pretty quickly that if I look at 21% furrow moisture, did any of those 6 crops come out of the ground? Another revelation, all crops need moisture, okay? How about on the other end of the spectrum at 60% in a saturated soil? You see that those crops struggle to get out of the ground. And so we don't have any final conclusions for you today, but as we start to mark that out on a graph, we want to begin to understand, once again, what is the right furrow moisture to target to ensure that every crop, all those seeds 1 through 1,000, come up in a short, consistent manner. And so all we can tell you today is that we are running down this path to help you utilize that technology on your farms on more crops than just corn. So generally speaking today, your take-home is this. No crops do well below 28% furrow moisture. And no crops did particularly well above 47%. But stay tuned. We hope to have more information for you in the near future. And so stay tuned on that, and we look forward to sharing some of those results with you. Kind of keeping with this path of moisture management, can we or can we not manage moisture with row cleaners, yes or no? So if I show you an example like this grower here, who's got an environment of no-till, and he's going to run through here, and if he does his job well, he's going to set his row cleaners correctly to pick and move residue, to create a nice, smooth environment for his gauge wheels to run through, for the disc openers to cut into, so that if all is accomplished well, he's got nice, clean strips to plant into. Okay? Why does he care about that? Infiltration of water and heat, right? And so some of you were hoping the tractor would run over my GoPro, but it didn't, sorry. However, that only manages residue on the surface. How about residue in the seed trench? And so we showed this lab experiment a couple years ago where we physically put residue next to the 6 seeds on the left. The 6 seeds on the right are completely clean. And all we want to know is there a difference in emergence timing from seed 1 to seed 6 with and without residue? And in this experiment, you can see that the seeds on the left begin to fire, so do the seeds on the right, but there's a 31-hour difference in delay from seed 1 to seed 6 on the side that has residue next to it, versus where it's clean, it's only 10 hours. The reason we bring this up is that some of you have been looking at this clean furrow metric on your 2020, coming in from Smart Furrow and saying, I have firsthand experience that when I adjust my row cleaners and I make them more aggressive, that clean furrow number goes up. There's others of you that might be joining us today that say, every time I make an adjustment with my row cleaners, that clean furrow number doesn't change. Can anybody put themselves in either of those buckets that's running it today? And so how do we help you make the most of that metric? If we think about where that residue is at, if you tell me every time I make an adjustment on my row cleaner, my clean furrow number goes up, I say with a high degree of confidence that you're managing surface residue. You're picking and moving the residue from the top profile and getting a nice clean environment to plant into. If you tell me every time I make an adjustment, Troy, nothing happens, row cleaners adjustment is not your solution. It's beginning to understand it's the management practices that come along with that. So as I think about, hey, are those incorporated residue? Is that old crop roots? Is that live cover crop that I'm seeing? Because the Smart Furrow is really, really smart. But guess what it doesn't know? Exactly what's there. All it knows is it's not as clean as it was down the line. Okay? So now you need to be thinking about management practices. And based on that, you determine what your target is. Why do we want to have a target to go after? Because based on our research for the first 2 years at Pontiac Farm, Jason Webster would say that for every 1% decrease in our clean furrow metric, as reported by the 2020 and Smart Furrow, it's a 1.2 bushel yield loss. And he'd also say that that's conservative. And so how do we manage that to a higher level to make sure you maximize that planter pass year in and year out? There's another way that we manage moisture with row cleaners. And it looks something like this. I would also argue this isn't management, but mismanagement of moisture. And why do I show that? Because I see far too many growers that are running a shark tooth row cleaner or conventional till environment. And they absolutely are changing the moisture line to the negative. So if you look at that, I'm not knocking a shark tooth row cleaner. What I'm saying is it's not intended to be run in these environments, is it? That's not the intent of an aggressive row cleaner that you see here. It works great placing the environment it was intended to run in. And then you go to the other end of the spectrum and you have growers that say, I'm conventional. I don't need to run a row cleaner. Anybody ever think that in this audience? Let me take you back to this spring. First-hand experience where growers had to work their ground slightly tacky, a little bit wet. And when they did that, what happened? Clods on the soil surface. And they don't have row cleaners because they've never needed them. And we're going back and we're scouting some late emerged fields. And I've got my GoPro video, and I'm shooting a GoPro of this real time and trying to figure out why do we have emergence issues. What we found is that when you have clods on top that you can't brush out of the way, they will sit right here on the top of your V-trench, and when your gauge wheels run over them, some of those will collapse down into the trench. And now you have a mixture of dry and moist soil. And you've just changed the moisture environment around those seeds. And that's painful. How about this grower that I took a picture from this past spring? Does that look like a no-till field to you? There was decisions made this past year where a 100% no-till grower got into the field the first day of planting and he could not get his planter in the ground. And so he has to make a determination. Do I add weight? He's already running liquid on the planter. He can't add much more weight. He goes and pulls out the vertical tillage tool out of the back of the barn that he hasn't used in 10 plus years because he's got to break the crust on the compacted soils from all the pounding rains this spring. And then we're there on the day of planting and we have to make a decision. How do I manage those clods and that residue that are left at the surface? So what's it look like he did? We're looking back and we're making adjustments to his row cleaners using the regulator in the cab, and we're making that more aggressive or taking aggression off. And we're picking and moving clods and residue to the center of the rows to create an opportunity to get uniform moisture onto every one of those seeds. Now, because he had the flexibility to make those adjustments, it was pretty easy to do, wasn't it? The other thing that we hear a lot in our travels is, well, Precision Planting has this 20/20 monitor. Seems like you guys put everything else from a control standpoint in it. Why not just put your row cleaner control into it? So we're excited to announce a beta for this spring of 2020. If you're interested to see your Precision Planting Premier dealer, that there will be an opportunity for you with an electronic row cleaner control module to run Clean Sweep with just a couple touches of your button in your Gen 3 2020. Okay? Now I'm going to take you a step back here. We've talked about a number of different things. Did that grower that was managing clods and residue with his row cleaners make the best decision on the day of planting based on the information he had, yes or no? He's getting feedback from his Smart Furrowers. We're looking visually. We're digging behind the planter. And I would argue that he made the right decision when I looked at his stand of corn. Okay? However, we're also weighing the risks of those. The risks that we knew was that if that gully washer came one more time that it had every time throughout the spring, we were going to wash soil back into that seed zone and change our seeding depth. And so as we continue to run down this path of how do we manage moisture well, we ask ourselves, what is actually the safer approach to moisture management? Our research would show that the safer knob is the depth knob. And so I'm going to ask Justin McMenamy to come forward and share with you some of our research around moisture management and the depth decision. Justin?
Thanks, Troy. I've tried to convince Troy that the 7 most expensive words are, I drive a Chrysler Town and Country. But he's still not converted. As Troy said, my name is Justin McMenamy. I work with the R&D team, and I have been working with the team over the last couple years on our research around depth and about moisture and how that moisture sits in the soil and how it affects our depth decision. I was thinking the other day, I was thinking about my son. So I have a little guy, his name's Hudson. And like most boys, he loves the pickup truck. He loves the car. He loves the idea of driving. He loves everything about the car. And if you let him put it into gear on one day, he's going to ask every day for the next 100 days if he can put it in gear. And if you let him turn the lights on, he's going to ask every day if he can turn the lights on. Now, there was one day that he was riding in the truck, and Mom wasn't with us. This is how every one of these stories starts, right? Mom wasn't with us. And so we pull off the road into the lane, and I, as a young father, had a great idea. Hey, bud, you want to drive today? Oh, yeah. So I reach back, and I grab my 4-year-old son out of his car seat, and I sit him in my lap, and I said, let's drive. Now, if as dads and moms, we look down this lane right here, and we have our 4-year-old sitting in the lap, what is going through our mind? Don't hit the fence, right? You can do quick, lasting, and expensive damage if we put the pickup truck into the fence. Now, if I tell Hudson, buddy, do not hit the fence. The entire environment now is about fence avoidance, right? Where is the pickup truck going in the first 30 feet down this lane? Out into the pasture. We are going to be great at not hitting the fence. But if I start over and I say, buddy, here's what we're going to do. This is how you drive. You see the road, it's going towards a ridge. We're just going to look at the ridge, and we're going to stay on the road the whole way. We're going to make small adjustments. We're not going to do big steering. We're just going to do small steering adjustments, and we're going to stay on the road. Do you think the outcome would be different? It would be, right? Now, honestly, I wasn't that young. I did keep my hand at 6 o'clock. We were not going to put the pickup truck into the fence. As it turns out, we as adults think about situations similarly. We make similar decisions. If we think about downforce on the row unit, we have known for as long as anyone in this room has been farming, we have known that you have to have downforce on the row unit. And if we don't have downforce on the row unit, we're going to put the crop in shallow, run the risk of dry soil, cost ourselves in emergence, and then cost ourselves in yield. And so as a result of that, when we consider where to put the T-handle on the downforce notch, what do? If a little's good, more's better. We're staying out of the fence, right? It was about 13 years ago that we started to put load pins on row units to understand the mechanics and the agronomics of that extra weight. Is this what the yield curve looks like? Is it truly a fence situation and everything else is fine? Or are there other things at play in downforce on the row unit? And what we've learned over the last 13 years through the study of downforce is that absolutely there are trade-offs. There are costs to excessive downforce. We've learned about things like hatchet roots. We've learned about things like sidewall slicking. These things cost us yield. And it's with this understanding of the trade-off curves that a product like Delta Force makes agronomic sense on the farm, to manage that force on the row unit, to keep us out of the fence, but to keep us out of the pasture. This is fundamentally the question that we are wrestling with on the topic of moisture and the planting depth decision. We want to understand what is the trade-off curves. What are the pros and cons across that range? And so we've run a number of trials and a number of studies over the last couple years. One of those studies was run by Jeremy, Jordan, and Dylan, and we ran that study by setting the planter. The even rows we planted at 1.5 inches. The odd rows we planted at 3 inches. Now, if we think about corn and we think about this part of the country, 1.5 inches is really shallow, really uncomfortably shallow to plant corn in this part of the country. And 3 inches is pretty doggone deep to put corn in this part of the country. But if we're going to understand the trade-offs, if we're going to understand the balance, we want to push the envelope. We want to test the outer edges. So we planted this field. We also put thermocouples in this field. We also put temperature sensors in this field at 1.5 inches, 2.25 inches, 3 inches, and then also at 6 inches. We planted this field on April 23rd, and we went back to scout it on May 13th, and this is what we found. We found that at 1.5 inches, we had good, even emergence. Everybody was out of the gate, and everybody was off to the races. Not so much at 3 inches. Something's going on at 3 inches. We have some emergence, we have some late emergers, and we have some complete misfires. Something's different. And so we start to dig in. The first place we look is moisture. Did we have adequate moisture? And what we find from the Smart Furrow data is we had 39% furrow moisture at 1.5 inches, and we had 43% furrow moisture at 3 inches. So it wasn't moisture. So let's look at the temperature data. Was it temperature that caused the issue? And at first glance, we really kind of see what you would expect from a temperature trace. The shallower you plant the crop, the more you feel the heat of the sun, and the more you feel the cool of the night. And so that 1.5 inch corn, it got a lot warmer in the day, and it cooled off a lot more at night. And the deeper you planted, the more you got under the blanket, the more you put more insulation on top of it. It didn't get as warm in the day, and it didn't get as cold at night. But if we look through this depth, what we saw across those 21 days is that the average temperature of those 3 depths is basically the same. It's all within 1 degree of each other. So if it's not moisture and it's not temperature, where's it at? And that's where the conversation starts to go to. It isn't strictly temperature that drives germination. It's GDU, it's growing degree units. And growing degree units usually are calculated off of the air, but in this instance, we have a temperature sensor right there next to the seed. So we can actually look and we can calculate what are the growing degree units for each one of these depths. And what we found is this is where the story starts to tell itself. At that 1.5 inch depth, we get the warmer day. We're cranking up the GDUs in the middle of the day. But germination stops at 50 degrees on the way down. At 49 degrees, germination is stopped. At 39 degrees, germination is still stopped. It's not more stopped at 39 degrees. It's stopped. And so what we found is that at the shallower depth, we're going to crank on the GDUs during the day, but there's not a penalty at night. Now, we aren't talking about seed chilling where we're getting down into freezing temperatures and we're hurting cell structures. We're talking about between that 37 and 49 degrees. In fact, across the 21 days, there was 21 more GDU at 1.5 inches than there were at 2.25 or 3 inches. The other aspect of our research that really seems to be coming through is the thought of the distance from the seed to the surface? How much energy and how far does that seed have to use and have to go to get from where we place it to the surface? Because all the energy that seed has to use is what he packed in his luggage to get to the surface. Until we start photosynthesis, we're not getting energy from anywhere else. And so the farther we are, the longer that race from the seed to the surface, we're finding that tiny differences in the energy in the seed or tiny differences in the environment can lead to very big differences at the moment of emergence. And this isn't different than what we see at the Olympics every 4 years. So every track race starts with 8 people, 8 athletes in the starting gates. We fire off the gun and everybody leaves at the exact same time. Now there are small variations in athleticism in the 8 people in the blocks. And what we see is in a 100-meter race, that variation in athleticism, it leads to a winner, it leads to a loser, but it leads to a very tight pack across the finish line. Now, if we take those same 8 athletes with the same variation in athleticism, we put them back in the blocks, but we extend the race farther and farther, what we see is that the photograph at the finish line looks different. Small differences in athleticism, we still have a winner, we still have a loser, but we have a much larger spread from the first to the last. So if this is our corn crop, we've got emergence, and then we've got some late emergers coming along across the back. This is fundamentally what we want to wrestle with. We want to understand across the planting depth decision, across that horizon, what are the trade-off curves, what are the pros and what are the cons. No matter what county you're in across the country and across the globe, the conversation around planting depth always brings up the topic of moisture and where is that moisture line. And it's a very, very important aspect of the conversation. But oftentimes what we see is that we find where that moisture line is, and then we pick the depth to stay out of the fence. And we say, well, if a little bit's good, a little bit more is probably better. What we've done and what we continue to do is to use Smart Furrow, to use the temperature data and the moisture data off of Smart Furrow to understand what does this trade-off curve look like. What are the pros and cons? What is trading against itself across the curve? And what we find is that the curve looks more like this. As we go to the deeper side of the profile, we are setting up that seed to have a longer race to run, to use more of its energy to get to the surface, that small variations in the environment can spread out how fast they cross the finish line. And as we get under the blanket farther and farther, we set ourselves up to accumulate fewer and fewer GDU in the heat of the day. But one of the questions we've wrestled with over the last couple years is we could plant a field like the one here on the left, and this would be a static field planted at 2 inches, and we can see the moisture variation. So we see dry parts of the field, we see wet parts of the field. But we get done with the field and we ask ourselves the question, what does this field look like at 1 3/4 inches? What does this field look like at 2 1/4 inches? What decisions could have been made in this field and what outcomes could have resulted from that? And it's really those questions that has driven us to a research tool that we're using, which we call the Smart Knife. So what the Smart Knife is we've taken the sensors out of 6 Smart Furrowers and we've built them into a knife. We put 3 on the left, we put 3 on the right, and they are stacked 1/2 inch from one another. So this Smart Knife, we can run it through the field, and it's going to give us temperature, moisture, organic matter, CEC, and residue across a 3-inch window, across the window of possible places that we could plant our crop. So now we don't just get a glimpse of what the field looks like right at the seeding depth, we get a glimpse of what the field looks like across the whole range of the seeding depths we could possibly use. And the information that we have gotten from our fields that we've run Smart Knife has been really interesting to look at. Here's a field that we ran on July 18th. So this was some prevent plant acres that we ran across. And this is the moisture profile at 1.25 inches of depth. So you see the purple triangle at 1.25 inches. Now if we run this loop, we get to see how the moisture line moves, how the moisture profile changes as we go down in depth from 1.25 inches to 2.75 inches. With Smart Knife, we can go back to this same field a day later, a week later, an inch of rain later, a month of drought later, and we can get the same understanding of how that moisture profile has moved across a period of time. It helps us to grow in our understanding of how in different soils moisture gets into the field, moisture moves in the field, moisture stays in the field, and moisture leaves in the field. Because it's not just the environment, the moment the seed is placed in the soil that matters. It's that environment for the next 72 hours. And so we need to understand the moisture both right now, but also moving into the future to make sure that we have enough moisture to finish and get into germination. One of the really cool things that we've also been able to do with this data is to take a single pass out of the field. So we're going to take a single pass out of the field, and we're now going to lay it on its side, and we're going to be able to look at the depth profile, all the possible planting depths, as we move across the pass. So if we take a look at this pass, now we got to explain the chart a little bit because it's by the size of the tractor. It looks like we're going about 50 feet into the ground, and that's not the case. So we're going from 1 inch to 3 inches down, and we're going 0.4 of a mile along the pass. So for the entire pass, this is the moisture line that we have available to us. Now, if we have a conversation and we say, what is the shallowest that you are comfortable planting your corn? Some would say 1.75 inches. And we say, what's the deepest that you're comfortable planting your corn? And they would say 2.25 inches. We can look at this information and we can put those numbers on the data and we can ask ourselves this question. Which T-handle setting is the best depth to pick for this pass right here? Right? The first third of the pass, we have moisture at every depth. 1.75 inches, 2.25 inches, we got more than enough moisture to make it to the finish line. But as we come through the middle of the pass, we don't have moisture in that range. We barely have enough moisture at 2.25 inches to get to the finish line. And so some may say, well, Justin, the answer is 2.25 inches. Give ourselves the chance to get as much moisture. And that may be true, but we will pay a penalty on the first third of this pass. We will pay the penalty of a longer race to the finish line. We will pay the penalty of not acquiring and accumulating GDU that are available to us because we're well into moisture and we're setting it deeper than it needs to be. It's this type of information and these types of conversations that fuels our passion for the continued development of the product that we call Smart Depth. Smart Depth is an electric motor that replaces the depth T-handle on your row unit. The depth mechanism stays the same, the gauge wheel arms stay the same, everything else stays the same, and we just replace the T-handle with an electric motor. In the conversations that we've had with growers over the last couple years, there's 3 areas that we see a product like Smart Depth could bring value to an operation. The first is row-to-row uniformity. We've run this test, a calibration, on probably 50 planters of looking at the variability of depth from row to row. It doesn't matter the color, it doesn't matter the age, it doesn't matter if it's just been rebuilt or if it hasn't been rebuilt in 6 years. There is row-to-row variability across the planter. We can set that T-handle to the exact same setting, and we're going to have minor variations in the castings, in the gauge wheel arms, in the opening discs, and that's going to lead to 1/4 to 1/2 inch or more of variability. So we think we're planting our corn at 2 inches, but the agronomics of our farm are more about some at 1 3/4 and some at 2 3/8. That's what the crop is actually feeling. The other one is in-cab adjustability. This year is a year for many of us. We put the acres in a month later than we'd like to. And I talked to growers and they said, Justin, usually in a normal year, I'll get out of the tractor and I'll dig 2 or 3 times a day. But this year, I had to get acres down, and so I dug first thing in the morning. I set my depth, and as long as I didn't change tillage practice throughout the day, I just hammered down. They didn't have the ability to ingest new information. They didn't have the ability. More candidly, they didn't have the time to ingest new information and to make an adjustment on the fly without having to take the tractor out of gear. The one we're most passionate about and the one that our research is most focused on is the moisture-based agronomy. It's to take that moisture map. It's to take the understanding of where the moisture is in your field from research like Smart Knife and Smart Furrow, and take that intelligence and build it into the Smart Depth module. For Smart Furrow to look for moisture and for Smart Depth to find that moisture. This last year, we ran 17 planters across the country with Smart Depth. We ran them from Mississippi to Minnesota, and I want to share some of that information with you. What we're looking at here is the row-to-row variability chart for the planters that were in the beta. And I want to talk about a few points. The first is the black hash marks on this chart. The black hash marks on this chart is the average planting depth for that planter last year. And I have them sorted from south to north, from Mississippi to Minnesota. And what we see is a general trend towards deeper planting depths as we move farther north in the country. And it's interesting because as we have these conversations, as we discuss what are the pros and cons, what is going into the weight, what is going into the calculus of making that depth decision, if we're talking to somebody in Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, oftentimes they're going to say, listen, I've got the heat units and I've got the rainfall, usually, but what I also have is I have a clay. And if I don't get it out, I'm going to get concreted in. If I don't get it out, I'm going to get crusted under. And so these guys in the south, they're looking for that moisture line, but they're looking to get as close to the surface as they can, pump it full of GDU, and punch through as quick as they possibly can. But you have that same conversation in the Red River Valley. You have that same conversation in northern Michigan, in Minnesota, and they're going to say, oftentimes, there's snow flying in the first acres that I'm planting. And I have to put that crop under a winter blanket so that I can isolate that crop from the first week, possibly 2 weeks of weather. And so we see that. We see 3/4 of an inch to almost an inch of increase in depth as that calculus changes, as the weather changes, as the crop changes, as the tillage practice changes. What we also see is the red bars, and this is the row-to-row variability that was on that planter before we installed Smart Depth. And what we see is there's a 1/4 inch on every planter. There's a 1/2 inch on some of those planters, and there's almost 3/4 of an inch in some planters as well. So we're setting the T-handles for the last 20 years at 2 inches, but we have crop going in at 1 5/8. We have crop going in at 2 1/4. One of the gentlemen we worked with was a guy by the name of Tyler Herkamp in Macon, Mississippi. Tyler rotates corn and cotton on beds. He plants with a John Deere 1725, and he ran Smart Depth this last year, and I called him and I said, hey, how did it go? What was your experience this last year? And he said, Justin, for years I'm always looking for moisture. He said, I'm a type of guy, I'm going to get out of the tractor 2, 3, maybe 4 times in a field. digging to make sure that I'm into moisture because I feel like I've got moisture variability inside of my beds. I said, so how did it go this year? He said, well, I started the year with Smart Depth. I left it in manual mode. I just told it what depth I wanted to plant because I wanted to look at the Smart Firmers and I wanted to see if there was moisture variability in the beds. He said, on the very first pass of the year, I confirmed my expectations. There was variability of moisture in the beds. He said, so I told Smart Depth, I said, this is the minimum I'm willing to plant depth. This is the maximum depth I'm willing to plant. And then I activated it and I said, Smart Firmer, you find moisture, Smart Depth, you go to it. He said, I ran the rest of the year in closed loop control. The rest of the year with Smart Firmer looking for moisture and Smart Depth going to it. I said, was there anything else that surprised you? Anything you weren't expecting with Smart Depth and Smart Firmer? And he said, as I said, I'm very particular about the moisture line. And he said, I have never been comfortable going in and opening up a field after dark because it doesn't matter. The tractor lights, the cell phone light, the flashlight, it is very difficult to find the moisture line after dark. He said, I was a number of weeks behind where I'd like to be, and halfway through the year, he said, I started to really get confident in Smart Firmer and Smart Depth. He said, I started going in and opening up fields after dark. I had to get acres in, and I knew I wasn't taking a risk at missing moisture when I had Smart Firmer and Smart Depth on the hunt for me. We also set up a number of planters as half planters. So half of the planter is a fixed T-handle, and half of the planter is Smart Depth. And we got a number of fields back that look like this. So we can see there's some variability in the moisture, and we can see that the depth changed as a result. But the really interesting part is when we peel the two halves of the planter apart, and we look at the left-hand side of the planter, and we look at the right-hand side of the planter separately. So if we look at the left-hand side of the planter, the fixed T-handle side of the planter depth map is pretty uninteresting. It all went in at 2 inches. Here's what the resulting furrow moisture map looked like at 2 inches in this field. And we can see there's a very wet zone through the middle of the field, and it's dry in the southeast corner of this field. So if we look at the right-hand side of the planter, how does Smart Depth react to this situation? We see that for this field, the guardrails were set at 1 3/4 and 2 1/4. In the wet areas of the field, Smart Depth knew there was moisture, and so it went to the top rail to 1 3/4. It said, I know I have moisture to get to the finish line, so I'm going to shorten the distance to the finish line, and I'm going to set myself up to get more GDU. In the dry part of the field, the southeast corner, Smart Depth says, moisture is king. I've got to find moisture. So it goes down to the 2 1/4 inch depth to see if we can get into moisture to make sure we've got enough water to get to germination, to get all the way through germination. What we found on the right-hand side of the planter is that in this field, that moisture line was below 2 inches and was at 2 1/4 inches. And so in this field, we did not plant into dry soil this last year. Now you remember from our Smart Knife data, there's going to be times and there's going to be fields where we have plenty of moisture at all of the possible depths. And there's going to be other fields and other passes where we have no moisture at all of the possible depths. And so we see even in this field, even though we went to 1 3/4, we still have more than enough moisture at 1 3/4. And I asked the grower, I said, hey, what are these white dots here in the middle of the field? And he said, well, don't tell anybody, but that's where I got the planter stuck. So there's moisture at all of the possible depths at that part of the field. Another grower that we worked with is Frank Farms, Brian Frank. He farms in Manitou, Illinois, which is about 12 miles west of here. They run a Kinsey 3600 on a corn and bean rotation. This is a field here right on the Mackinac River. You can see the Mackinac River right there to the west. This is a 100-acre field with mile-long passes. And talking to Brian, he said, this field is very interesting because it's fed with a gravel slough off of the river. And so there are years where a part of the field, and that slough is the wettest part of the field. But in the following year, if the river's down, that will be the driest part of the field. And so Brian planted the big field with half the planter at fixed T-handles and half the planter at smart depth. If we look at the fixed T-handle side of the planter, we see that 82% of the seeds went into adequate moisture. 82% of the seeds had enough moisture to get to the finish line. 18% of the seeds are going to need more moisture to come from somewhere in order to get to the finish line. If we look at how Smart Depth responds in this environment, we see that about 30% of the time there was more than enough moisture, and Smart Depth went to the 1 3/4 inch depth and said, hey, we're going to shorten the distance to the finish line, and we're going to give ourselves every opportunity to rack up the GDU. And about 50% of the time in this field, Smart Depth said, hey, I don't have enough moisture, so I'm going to move down into the profile because moisture is king, and that's what I'm looking for. On the right-hand side of the planter, the average planting depth ended up being exactly 2 inches across the field. If we now compare the moisture of the left-hand side of the planter to the right-hand side of the planter, what we see is that 82% of the crop went into adequate moisture at a fixed T-handle setting, and 90% of the crop went into moisture with Smart Depth. Now we remember, there's going to be places in the field where there isn't moisture in the range that we're comfortable planting. And so we're going to go down, but we're not going to hit that moisture. So this is not a number that we can get to 100% in every field every year. There's going to be fields where that moisture line may be at 5 inches. We're not planting corn at 5 inches to get to moisture. The trade-offs get out of hand, right? So even though we're not going to get to 100% in every field, every one of these percentages matter. Every one of these percent is another percent of the crop that has enough moisture to get to the finish line right out of the starting gates. If we look at the yield curve, if we look at the yield results for the big field, we've broken it into 3 areas. One is the very dry parts of the field. So this is where Smart Depth went all the way down to 2 1/4 inches and was looking for moisture. This is where Smart Depth is still going down, but we're now much closer to that 30% moisture line. And then this is the area of the field where we had plenty of moisture through the entire range, and Smart Depth went to the shallower side. This gives us an indication on the big field of what that trade-off curve looks like. We see in the dry parts of the field, there's a 5 bushel increase to going deeper to get into moisture. As we get closer to that 30% line, what we see is there's a 3 bushel increase. Again, moving down to get into moisture. And on this field, where we had plenty of moisture and we went 1/4 inch shallower, we saw just over a 1 bushel increase, for a field average of a 3 bushel increase on the big field for planting into variable depth looking for moisture. You know, it's this time of the year where we really start to see a lot of depth studies being published. Universities publish them, input companies publish them, and if you're like me, there's sometimes I struggle what to do with a depth study. I'm looking at it, okay, is there something I can learn from it? What can I make? What adjustment can I make off of this depth study? And if you look at a depth study like this, oftentimes what I'll do is I'll say, well, 1 inch, I mean, I'm not going to put corn in at 1 inch. And outside of that, it pretty much looks like it doesn't matter. So what am I doing? For the last 30 years, we've put the corn in here. So I guess for year 31, we're going to do the same. What we found is, and this is a depth study that we ran in Morton, Illinois, about 10 miles north of here in 2018. And it was on an ideal soil. So that's a soil that has the perfect mix of soil, water, and air to get us germination and emergence. What we found in our depth studies is that the story really starts to tell itself as we add the Smart Furrow data to that. As we now look at this exact same chart, but now we have Smart Furrow data, what we see is that this 1 inch drop-off has as much to do with not planting into moisture as it does the distance to the surface. And we know intrinsically there is an enormous drop-off when we don't plant into moisture. We also see the other side of the curve here. This is the cost in this field for planting and giving ourselves a longer track to run to the finish line and not acquiring as many GDU. So as we think about this field, if we had smart depth and we set the guardrails at 1 3/4 and 2 1/4, smart depth would say, hey, I have the moisture, so I'm going to move to the shallower side. I'm going to move to the 1 3/4 line to give myself the best potential for GDU and to cut down the race from the start to the finish. This is an ideal soil. We take a test that's run right behind us here in R&D last year in a very loose soil. Now, a soil can be loose for a number of reasons. It can be sand. It can be tillage practice that makes it loose. What defines it as loose is there's a lot of air in the top profile, which is going to push that moisture line farther down into the profile. As we look at these results, by adding the Smart Furrow data, it tells us what we expect is that the winning result is planting into moisture in this loose soil. What this curve here in the loose soil is the left-hand side of the curve. This is the cost of planting into dry soil. In this field, if we had smart depths with the guardrails at 1 3/4 and 2 1/4, smart depth is going to move towards the deeper side of the curve to that 2 1/4 inches, and it's going to stop there because we told it that we don't want to plant corn deeper than 2 1/4 inches. But what we're going to see is the Smart Furrow map is still going to show us that our moisture is only 20 or 25%. The Smart Furrow map is going to tell us we aren't yet planting into moisture. So what we have in this instance is we have the information and the tools to make a decision. For some farms, some years, some fields, some passes, we're going to look at this and we're going to say, you know what? I see the storm clouds on the western horizon. I don't need to go deeper. Water's coming. There's other fields, years, passes, where we're going to look at this and we're going to say, I'm not into moisture. I need to be into moisture. You have the information and the tools that you need to make that decision in the moment where we're putting $3,000 per hour into the ground to make that decision. We don't have to wait till next January when we see the planting depth study tell us which depth was the appropriate depth. So let's move to the other side. Let's go to the tighter soils. On this field, I forgot the money line. On this field in the loose soil, there was an 18 bushel difference to planting a 2-inch T-handle setting and planting into moisture. And that's what we'd expect. We'd expect that if you miss moisture, there's a dozen or more bushels to be lost by planting into dry soil. Now, as we think about a tighter soil, this is going to be a soil. It could be a tight clay. It could be a compacted soil. It could be a no-till soil. It's any soil that doesn't have a lot of oxygen in that top layer. That moisture line sits very, very high in the soil profile. For some of you, last year, it was most of your fields because you got 20 inches of rain in March and April. Right? There were a lot of fields last year that the moisture line sat very, very high in the profile. What we see here is in that tight soil, that seedling has to fight like heck for every 1/4 inch. That's a tough fight through that compacted soil, through that no-till, through that clay. It's a tough fight. There's a lot of energy that goes into every 1/4 inch. And so what we're seeing here is the right-hand side of the curve. The cost of fewer GDU, the cost of a longer race from the start to the finish line. If we had smart depth in this field from 1 1/4 to 2 1/4, smart depth is going to see that there's more than enough moisture and it's going to move to the shallower side to that 1 3/4 to give us a shorter race to run and to get more GDU into the seed early in its life. In this field, which was run in Morton, Illinois, 10 miles north of here, there was a 10 bushel increase from the 2-inch T-handle setting to planting and shortening up that track and getting more GDU. So what's next? what's next for Smart Depth? What's next for our research? Our commitment is to continue this research, to continue this understanding of what are the pros and the cons and what are the trade-offs of that depth decision across the range of possible depths. But I want to ask you to participate. I want you guys to be involved, right? So this year, as we go out to Plant 2020, there's going to be a field in which you have plenty of moisture. Now, I don't know, maybe it's because the farmhand or your son is digging and he sees that the moisture line's at 3/4 of an inch. Maybe like Troy's photograph, you hire the entire senior class to come out and dig behind the planter for you and they tell you that there's moisture at 3/4 of an inch. Or maybe you use Smart Furrow and it tells you that you have more than enough moisture. Historically speaking, in these fields, we've had the feeling of, I'm not putting it in the fence in this field. I have nothing to worry about on this field because I know I've got moisture. What I want to ask you to do in 2020 is to start that understanding, to do that research on your operation, on your fields, in your counties, to start that understanding. So in this field, in that soaked field, when you go to refill, go to one row and move the T-handle 1/4 of an inch shallower. And go to the row right next to it and go 1/2 inch shallower. Not for the whole field, one pass, just one pass. And put that pass next to the office, next to the shop, next to the house. Because what I want you to do is I want you to scout it. I want you to look at it, see how it emerges, see how it tassels, see what it looks like at yield. Start to understand what are those trade-offs when we're in more than enough moisture, but we give that seed a long race to run to get to the finish line. Now, I know I've talked to enough farmers across enough years. I know what I just asked you to do is an extremely uncomfortable ask. The depth on the planter is sacred, right? Everybody has their grandpa's index finger in a glass jar on the mantle in the living room, and that is the depth we plant. I don't know what happened to Grandpa, but by God's grace, we kept his finger, because otherwise we don't know what we do, right? What I want to remind each and every one of you is that you have been running this study on your farm for the last 30 years. There is a 1/2 inch of variability on that planter and has been, and you have been putting in rows at 1/4 inch and possibly 3/8 of an inch shallower than your T-handle setting. But we've never tracked it. We've never flagged it. We've never scouted it. So you guys too, start that understanding of what is the cost of spending our time out in the pasture on the right-hand side of the curve. I thank you guys for your time. What we're going to do here is we're going to have a quick closing video. So we're not going to go back over to the auditorium for another session. We're going to have a quick closing video here, and then I will come back up and we'll dismiss. And then we will, if you have questions, you can come up and we can chat afterwards. Thanks.
Farming, it's not just a job title, it's a way of life. I wasn't born into a farm family, but I wish I had been. There's nothing that excites me more than getting in the field and operating equipment. I had some farmers take me under their wing growing up, which gave me the opportunity to feel like a farm kid. And my best memories were, and they still are, made in the combine, in the grain cart tractor, or hauling manure. And everyone I work with at Precision Planting is passionate about agriculture. We love the farming communities that we are a part of. Every day we come to work focused on how to better the lives of farmers with the equipment they already own. We live and breathe farming, and we are thrilled to speak directly with growers, whether that is on your farms throughout the year or at an event like Winter Conference. We know that growers that come to Winter Conference in 2020 want to have 2020 be their best year yet. A year of confidence, a year of profitability. Will there be challenges? Of course. That's just part of this way of life, but it's a good way of life, and farmers are resilient. I know that from the experiences that the Precision Planting team has had on farms across the world, that there are simple changes that farmers can implement to impact their way of life and their family. Planting in 2020 is coming soon, and it's a necessity to look into the equipment and technology that you have to see if there are any small changes that can be made to improve this season or any major changes that can impact your farm's bottom line in 2020. One thing we have seen from growers who implement changes to improve is they do it. They take action and make changes. They calculate and then act, and they get smarter every season because of taking action. You know, a lot was discussed today about the pitfalls of a planter, pitfalls that technology cannot overcome. We have a firm belief at Precision Planting that the right technology will absolutely enhance a grower's operation and planting paths, but that planter has to be mechanically sound. So what should you do to prepare for 2020? The first action is to make sure the iron of the planter is ready to go to the field. Disc openers, gauge wheels, bearings, if they're not right, they defeat technology. Connect with a premier Precision Planting dealer and work with them to evaluate your planting equipment. Technology may not be the first thing that is needed. Maybe it's a little maintenance that can help you get smarter every season. It's 2020, and I've talked to some of you who have said, hey, it's 2020. I bet that's a special year for the 2020 monitor. It is, but the truth is the 2020 has been special for 12 years. 12 years of showing growers with any brand of planter, any size of planter, planting anywhere in the world, the agronomic truth of their equipment putting the seed in the ground. 2020 is a tool that brings confidence to those that use it, because the knowledge 2020 provides leads to action that improves the farm. Tens of thousands of growers have realized that once you can see what is really happening on the planter, you get confidence to make downforce adjustments, confidence to change a depth setting because you see a low furrow moisture reading, confidence that the next new technology will pay. So what is the best way to get confidence in 2020? It's with a 2020 on your planter. And it's not just knowledge, but acting on that knowledge that will transform the way you operate your planting equipment. If you aren't running a 2020 today, get smarter this season. Contact a premier dealer. 2020 is the perfect year to get confidence with a 2020. There are some other principles that growers just need to try. Challenge traditional thinking. We don't think we were able to write the ending of your story with fertility and profitability, but we think we can sure suggest the beginning of your story. It starts with reallocation of fall fertilizer to spring and split applying nitrogen in season, with some of that nitrogen being applied with the planter. It's had tremendous impact on profitability. You add some tanks to the planter and tender some nitrogen along with seed, but it's not just a couple dollars an acre in ROI, it is significant return. Giving the plant an IV of fertilizer throughout the season just makes sense. If you are leaving winter conference today and haven't challenged your current fertility plan, we would encourage you to try a new practice with fertility. Consider the gains you can get with planter applied, banded fertility. So what's the end of your story? Well, it is yet to be written, but it starts with rethinking nutrient management to get smarter every season. One of the other concepts that was talked about quite a bit at winter conference today is challenging the status quo. Fertilizer programs, planting speed, planting to that second knuckle. Why do we do it the way we do it? We understand how challenging it can be to do on-farm research when weather, logistics, and time are working against you and it's go time. But you always need to continue learning and improving. One of the ways that we get better at precision planting is through the Precision Technology Institute. The PTI farm is not product development research, but real farming, looking at products and practices that challenge the status quo. We provide you with information and insight to improve your bottom line in a practical way. We want to share the trial results with you, with the story of the season, the yield data, and the reason why the agronomy, technology, and equipment performed the way that it did, so you can challenge your own status quo. Inside PTI provides you the results of the on-farm research that you want, so that you can make decisions about practices, equipment purchases, and what technology is right for your farm. It's not just Precision Planting's research, it's your research. Whether or not you have ever used anything with a Precision Planting logo on it, sign up to receive Inside PTI emails each week. You'll get ideas to challenge your own status quo and get smarter every season. We've had a great day with each of you at Winter Conference 2020. What now? Talk to a Precision Planting dealer. The men and women sitting in the seats around you wearing the black shirts. These folks are the experts in the community when it comes to the intersection of agronomy, technology, and equipment. Whether it's advice on planter setup, someone to go over your planter with a fine-tooth comb to make sure it's mechanically sound, or prioritizing what technology will provide you knowledge and control of the environment the seed is being placed in, the Precision Planting Network of over 550 premier dealers are the experts for you to talk to. Some of you were invited by a dealer today. Others of you need to take an action before you leave today to ask a Precision Planting employee in a white shirt who a good dealer in your area would be. But don't wait. Make sure you take advantage of the expertise of a premier precision planting dealer prior to planting in 2020. I know for me, I have never lived a perfect day in my life, and I bet most of you would say you haven't had a perfect growing season or grown a perfect crop. But I think perfection is the wrong measurement to use. I can get caught up in analyzing the next right thing to do, and sometimes I think and think and think, and what I really need to do is act. I need to act or nothing will happen, nothing will change, and I will continue my current status quo and be stagnant. So in 2020, join us in measuring progress, not measuring whether we are doing things perfectly. Improving is the goal. How can you get better in 2020? How can you make progress on your farm? Make a decision, implement that decision, and get better. Don't sit back and wonder if you are doing the best for your farm, your future, and your family. Take a step and know that you are. Seek out a premier precision planting dealer's expertise. Premier dealers are the key for you and for farmers across the world to improve in 2020 and to continue getting smarter every season.
I want to personally thank each and every one of you for coming out today, spending the day with us, learning with us, sharing your understanding with us. As you go, we have a gift for each person that came today. Also, reminder that we have show stands, we have engineers, we have employees that you can talk to. If you have questions about product, there are dealers in the black shirts that you can talk to. And thank you, and have a safe trip home.